Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging my gratitude for the opportunity to meet on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. These lands are covered under Treaty 3, the Between the Lakes Purchase, and I want to reaffirm the Ontario Green Party's commitment to the truth and reconciliation process as we combat the legacy of colonialism and heal relationships. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Victor Doyle, former provincial manager of planning for Central Ontario and lead planner for the Greenbelt plan. I want the Premier to know that Ontarians are smart. They know that the only Greenbelt scam is this government's plans to pave over the farmland that feeds us, the wetlands and forests that protect us and clean our drinking water, and the Greenbelt that they love. They know that paving over the Greenbelt is not going to solve the housing crisis. They know that we don't have to choose between protecting the places we love and building the homes we need. And they have been clear in voicing their opposition to this government's expensive, destructive, pave at all costs approach. I stopped by the Dufferin Rouge Agricultural Preserve last weekend, and I saw home after home, farm after farm, proudly displaying their signs, telling the Premier to keep his promise to keep his hands off the Greenbelt. It's clear that no one has signed on to this government's Greenbelt sell-off, with the exception of a few handful of land speculators who will benefit. And that's why I'm here today, to put an end to the Premier's attack on the Greenbelt and to stand up for what we all know is worth protecting. Despite what the Premier says, the Greenbelt is not an empty field full of weeds, and it was not drawn up with crayons. The Greenbelt cleans our air and water, absorbs rainfall to protect us from flood risk, and provides home for more than 78 species at risk. It's 721,000 acres of protected wetlands, grasslands, and forests that provide $3.2 billion worth of ecosystem services and offset 71 million tons of CO2 each year. It's 750,000 acres of some of the best farmland in Canada that plays a vital role in the province's $50 billion food and farming economy that employs over 875,000 people. And it's much needed green space where we spend time with our loved ones and experience the mental health and physical health benefits of having access to nature. So yes, there's a lot at stake right now. That's why today I'm tabling 3 private members' bills that, if passed, would ensure that the Greenbelt is protected for present and future generations. The first, no more highways in the Greenbelt, would prohibit controlled access highways from being constructed through the Greenbelt. The second, no more pits and quarries in the Greenbelt, would prohibit license applications for new pits and quarries and expansion of existing pits and quarries in the Greenbelt. And the third, the Hands Off the Greenbelt Act, would ban land swaps by restricting the minister and the lieutenant governor and council from removing lands from the Greenbelt in the future and retroactively to December 13th, 2022, one day before the Ford government filed regulations removing protected lands from the Greenbelt. Ontario Greens know that we can build the 1.5 million homes we need, homes we can actually afford, in the communities where people want to live, near where they work. We already have enough land approved for development within the GTHA to build 2 million homes, 500 more million than the government's $1.5 million target. And we know that people want to live in affordable communities. They want to buy homes that they can afford in communities that are connected, where they can live, work, and play. They don't want to have the costs of expensive sprawl imposed on them, and they don't want to lose the precious Greenbelt that so many Ontarians love and want to protect. And that's why we're standing up for homes, people, and planet, and saying to the Premier, hands off the Greenbelt, and yes, in my backyard. I'd now like to welcome Victor Doyle to say a few words about how the Greenbelt was designed and why it is so important to the present and future of Ontario. Thank you, Victor.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning. I'd like to start just by reminding people that while many people think Ontario is a massive province, which it is, Southern Ontario is just a fraction of that. Probably 90% of Ontario is north of the Canadian Shield, and 10% is down here in South Central Ontario, where probably 75% of us live and where we're expecting another 5 million people. It's therefore a very fragile and finite landscape, and yet it's been heavily impacted by urban sprawl. We know some of the impacts, including the catastrophic loss of farmland. And switching to time, we know that we plan for 25 or 30 years, but urbanization is permanent. When we pave the landscape, it's gone forever. And to counteract that, the Greenbelt was supposed to be permanent. The legislation and the plan speak about its permanency to help offset the impacts of sprawl. And yet, some people think we should be able to swap land in and out of the Greenbelt. Well, that is antithetical to its entire purpose of being retained in perpetuity, because this landscape is all we have, this small portion of Ontario, and we have to manage it forever. And so when we developed the Greenbelt, it was designed and created by being informed by the best science and data available, with the experts from hydrogeology, terrestrial and aquatic ecology, agrologists, and climate specialists. And these experts provided all sorts of detailed analyses to help inform the creation of the Greenbelt. And it included municipalities, conservation authorities, all sorts of civil society organizations like the Federation of Agriculture, academia, and many, many local groups who have ground-based knowledge of their communities. So it was really a team effort involving people with thousands of years of collective experience in terms of the Southern Ontario landscape. And one of the other layers we looked at, in addition to agriculture and natural heritage and our water resources, was land for growth. And so much land was left out of the Greenbelt to allow places to grow, the name of the Growth Plan Act. And that planning and act have led to, as Mike said, 2 million homes being planned on the land that we currently had approved. The regional planning commissioners have just identified that there's upwards of 1.3 million homes either under construction, approved, or in process on those lands. In total, there's probably 200,000 acres of land approved for urbanization in Southern Ontario before last fall, where the government added another 50 to 60,000 acres of land just in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. So those numbers reveal to me that the growth plan has been working entirely as planned, and what we really need to do is mobilize the development industry to ratchet up housing construction based on those plans. It's not about adding more land, and there's certainly no justification whatsoever to remove even 1 acre of land from the Greenbelt for any form of urbanization, including housing. There was a coordinated review of the Greenbelt and Growth Plan in 2017, informed by a multi-sector panel, and they concluded the Greenbelt plan was working exactly as intended. The growth plan was working too, but needed to be strengthened. So these are not flawed policy frameworks. They are actually revealing a really sound vision for the future of South Central Ontario, and we need to stay the course, protect the Greenbelt, and not allow it to be damaged or weakened in any way. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor, for providing that historical context around the creation of the Greenbelt Plan, why it's important for present and future generations, and we're now available to answer questions, including myself or Victor.
I'll take either you, both of you want to weigh in eventually.
Sure,
I mean,
yeah.
Mike, you're a politician, you want to talk. But I wanted both of you to address this talking point the Premier uses repeatedly, which he says, the Liberals opened it up 17 times and nobody raised a fuss. I actually wrote about it when they did that, but he leaves that out. Can you compare that, what happened under the Liberals and the Greenbelt changes, to now?
Well, I mean, first of all, I did raise some questions about the Liberals removing some acreage from the Greenbelt, but let's put it into context. When the Liberal government did that, it was part of the coordinated review. 340 acres were removed from the Greenbelt, and there was a fairly broad consensus that was an appropriate thing to do, and it was part of the coordinated review that was in the legislation, because I think most legislators recognize that when you pass laws, you need to review them sometime in the future to make sure they're working as intended and to correct any mistakes that might be in the legislation. So that has no comparison whatsoever to what's happening in the present day, where we don't have any coordinated review, and the government is just willy-nilly. If there's anyone who's got crayons on a napkin in a back room, it's the Premier and the 7,400 acres that the government is removing from the Greenbelt. And contrary to what the Premier says, these are not like vacant fields of weeds. I mean, I was just last weekend in the Dufferin Rouge Agricultural Preserve, which is the largest area they're removing, 4,800 acres. All over the place, I saw farmers preparing their lands for spring planting. This is some of the best farmland in North America that the Premier is calling a field of weeds and planning to pave over. It's wrong, and it's contrary to the science and evidence-based process that went into the design of the Greenbelt. I don't know, Victor, do you want to comment? Or
The only other thing I'd add is, should I come up
Yeah.
here? The only other piece I would add is that through that coordinated review, which was involved extensive public participation, as Mike said, there was upwards of 800 requests to remove land from the Greenbelt or to exempt land within it from the policies of the Greenbelt. And only 15 or 17 were granted in a very small amount of land. And again, these were refinements, if anything, and very different from the removal of broad chunks of land, including the Dufferin Rouge Agricultural Preserve, the longest protected agricultural reserve in Ontario.
And Mike, about your private members' bills, I mean, obviously, these are snowballs in the inferno, but can you elaborate a bit on the idea of permanence? Because that's something Victor brought up. The idea was the Greenbelt should be permanent, but we know that nothing in Ontario is permanent. It can be rewritten on a napkin or with crayons at any moment by a government. So how does that work with, have you talked to constitutional lawyers or something, but I don't quite understand how that would become permanent.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what we've unfortunately learned from Premier Ford's actions, that future governments can pass legislation that overturns the permanency of protected lands. I think the bills I've put forward reflect public sentiment, the overwhelming desire of the people of Ontario to protect the Greenbelt. And so the three bills I'm proposing, if they would happen to pass, would strengthen protections for the Greenbelt. But, you know, it's very difficult, as you've acknowledged, to prevent future governments from changing legislation. I mean, that's just the constitutional nature of our democracy. But I think anything we can do to strengthen protections for the Greenbelt, and that's exactly what my proposed bills will do, I think makes it harder for future governments to engage in the kinds of land swaps this government is engaging in. And I think anything we can do to strengthen protections for the Greenbelt and to show the overwhelming public sentiment to protect the Greenbelt is important steps in public debate right now.
And have you been in touch with the federal environment minister or his office about asking him to intervene?
Yeah, I've put that out very clearly in statements, and had an opportunity, just happened to be at an event where the minister was at, and express my positions on the fact that I support the federal government conducting an impact assessment, not only on the removal of Greenbelt protected lands, but also on Highway 413, the Bradford bypass, as well.
He's made pretty strong comments about the Duffins Rouge Agricultural Preserve, warning developers to not think that they've struck gold, and saying that he could intervene under the auspices of endangered species or whatever. Do you have faith that the federal government will try to block something that might happen in there?
Well, you know, I think we should take the minister at his word, and I would caution any land speculator or developer that wants to proceed in that regard, given the comments from the federal environment minister, and those were welcome comments. Obviously, there's a direct connection between the Duffin Rouge Agricultural Preserve and the Rouge Urban Park. And so, you know, I welcome those comments, and I welcome the federal government upholding its responsibilities to protect endangered species on all Greenbelt lands. If I could just add one more thing to that, you know, Canada has an international obligation. We've signed a treaty to protect 30% of our lands by 2030. Yesterday's Auditor General's report was deeply disturbing that Ontario, you know, had set a goal of protecting 17% of our lands by 2020. We failed to meet that goal. We're only protecting about 10%, according to the Auditor General's report. And when you have a government that starts removing protected land from the Greenbelt, it just makes it more difficult for Ontario to meet its obligations, as well as the federal government to meet its obligations around protected lands. And when it comes to the Duffin Rouge Agricultural Preserve, I mean, not only were those lands protected by the Greenbelt, but they were also protected by conservation easements. And when you start removing those kinds of protections, you interject speculation into further speculation into land. And that particularly negatively affects the farm community. It is so hard for young people especially to enter the profession of farming because land costs are so high, and that directly affects the profitability of farming. And so protected lands have a role in removing speculation from the farmland market. And now that those protections, or the government's in the process of removing those protections, that interjects speculation back into land, which is going to make it even more difficult now for especially new farmers to enter into the profession because of the high land acquisition costs. They're going to be competing with developers now, and that just makes it very difficult, the financial viability and profitability of farming, if their land costs are that high.
And you mean land outside the preserve, other lands that
well, it's going to interject land speculation into the Greenbelt now. One of the benefits of the having Greenbelt protected land is that it tamped down on speculation, because as a speculator, why would you buy that land if you can't develop it? Which then makes it more viable for farmers to be able to afford it. When you start removing those protections, you interject speculation on all of that land, driving up costs and making it financially difficult for farmers to make a living. Anyone else? Great. Well, thanks, everyone. Appreciate you joining us this morning, and look forward to introducing my bills later today and furthering this conversation. Thank you.